Ambassador Sarah Mitchell sat in her office at the United States Embassy in Abidjan, reviewing cables from Washington with growing concern. The situation in Ivory Coast was rapidly becoming an international crisis that could destabilize the entire West African region. Phone calls from the State Department had become daily occurrences, with officials demanding clear assessments of President Ouattara's grip on power. The European Union had initially supported Ouattara during the 2010-2011 crisis, viewing him as a democratic reformer who would bring stability to the strategically important nation. Now European capitals were reconsidering their position as reports flowed in about constitutional violations and military unrest. French President Emmanuel Macron faced a particularly delicate situation. France maintained significant economic interests in Ivory Coast, especially in the cocoa trade that supplied European chocolate manufacturers. The Élysée Palace had invested considerable diplomatic capital in supporting Ouattara's previous elections, making it difficult to abandon him without losing face. However, intelligence reports from French military advisors stationed in the Mime country painted a troubling picture. Colonel Pierre Dubois, the senior French military attaché, had sent encrypted messages describing unprecedented unity between civilian protesters and military units opposing the president's third term. The situation has moved beyond traditional political opposition, Dubois reported. This appears to be a genuine constitutional crisis, with broad popular support spanning ethnic and regional divisions. Military units we've trained and equipped are now protecting protesters rather than the government. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, found itself in an equally complicated position. The regional body had previously intervened in Ivory Coast to ensure democratic governance, but now faced the awkward situation of potentially having to act against a sitting president they had previously supported. Nigerian President Bola Tinubu, serving as ECOWAS chairman, convened an emergency meeting in Abuja to address the crisis. Representatives from Ghana, Senegal, Mali, and other member states gathered to discuss their response to what was clearly becoming a regional concern. Dr. Amina Hassan, a political analyst at the University of Ghana, had been monitoring the situation closely. Her reports to various African governments highlighted how the Ivorian crisis could inspire similar constitutional challenges across the continent, where several aging leaders were considering extending their terms beyond constitutional limits. What's happening in Ivory Coast isn't just about one president, she explained to the ECOWAS assembly. It's about whether African democracies will respect their own constitutions or slide back into the era of presidents for life that characterized our post-independence period. The African Union, AU, dispatched a high-level delegation led by former Mozambican President Joaquim Chissano to assess the situation. Chissano, respected across the continent for voluntarily stepping down after 2 terms, was seen as an ideal mediator who could speak credibly about constitutional term limits. Upon arriving in Abidjan, Chissano was surprised by what he encountered. Rather than a typical political crisis driven by elite competition, he found a grassroots movement with broad popular support that transcended traditional divisions. His meetings with protest leaders, including student Samuel Traoré and journalist Marie Kouassi, revealed sophisticated political thinking and genuine commitment to democratic principles. These young people understand democracy better than many of their leaders, Chissano confided to his staff after the meetings. They're not asking for power for themselves. They're demanding respect for institutions that will outlast any individual politician. The international media began paying closer attention to the crisis. CNN's West Africa correspondent, James Okafor, arrived in Abidjan to find a story far more complex than typical African political upheaval. His reports highlighted the peaceful nature of the protests and the constitutional basis for the opposition to Ouattara's third term. BBC reporter Catherine Williams interviewed Colonel Fofana at his barracks, producing a segment that surprised international audiences. Here was a military officer articulating sophisticated arguments about civilian control of the military and constitutional governance, contradicting stereotypes about African military leaders seeking power for themselves. "We swore an oath to protect the Constitution," Fofana told the BBC. That oath doesn't become void when it becomes inconvenient for politicians. Our job is to serve the people and the law, not the personal ambitions of any individual, including the president. These international media reports began shifting global opinion about the crisis. Initially, many foreign governments had assumed this was another example of political instability in Africa. The reality of a principled constitutional movement with military support challenged those assumptions. The United Nations Security Council held an emergency session to discuss the situation. Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed concern about constitutional violations while calling for peaceful dialogue. However, behind closed doors, UN officials were quietly impressed by the disciplined, nonviolent nature of the opposition movement. China, which had significant infrastructure, investments in Ivory Coast, found itself in an awkward position. Beijing generally supported stability and non-interference in domestic affairs, but Chinese companies were reporting difficulties operating amid the growing protests and military uncertainty. Wang Wei, China's ambassador to Ivory Coast, met secretly with both government officials and opposition representatives to assess the situation. His reports to Beijing suggested that Ouattara's position was weakening rapidly and that China might need to prepare for a political transition to protect its investments. International human rights organizations added their voices to the chorus of concern. Human Rights Watch documented cases of government attempts to suppress peaceful protesters, while Amnesty International highlighted the military's unusual role in protecting rather than suppressing civilian demonstrations. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund began expressing concerns about political stability affecting economic development programs. Ivory Coast had been considered a success story for international development assistance, making the current crisis particularly disappointing for multilateral institutions. European cocoa companies, which depended on Ivorian production for their supply chains, began lobbying their governments to take stronger action. The CEO of a major Swiss chocolate manufacturer met with EU officials in Brussels, warning that continued instability could disrupt global cocoa markets and affect European consumers. Our religious leaders also played an international role in the crisis. The Vatican dispatched a special envoy to meet with Catholic leaders in Ivory Coast, while Islamic organizations across West Africa issued statements supporting peaceful resolution of the constitutional crisis. The Carter Center, founded by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, announced plans to send a mediation team to Ivory Coast. The center's experience with African electoral crises and its reputation for impartial mediation made it a respected voice that both sides might accept. International pressure began focusing on finding a face-saving exit strategy for President Ouattara. Diplomatic sources suggested that foreign governments were exploring options for the president to step down gracefully while preserving some of his legacy and avoiding potential prosecution. French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna made a surprise visit to Abidjan for private meetings with Ouattara. While the official communiqué spoke of supporting democratic dialogue, diplomatic sources revealed that Colonna had delivered a tough message about the limits of French support for constitutional violations. The African Development Bank, headquartered in Abidjan, found itself in the uncomfortable position of operating in a country where its host government was facing a constitutional crisis. Bank President Akinwumi Adesina publicly called for respect for democratic institutions while privately working with international partners to plan for various scenarios. International observers noted something unprecedented. African institutions and leaders were taking the lead in addressing the crisis rather than waiting for Western intervention. ECOWAS, the AU, and individual African leaders were asserting their commitment to constitutional governance in ways that hadn't been seen in previous decades. The international community's response was also notable for what it didn't include. Unlike previous African crises, there was no talk of military intervention or regime change. Instead, the focus was on supporting the legitimate constitutional demands of the Ivorian people while encouraging peaceful dialogue. As international pressure mounted, President Ouattara found himself increasingly isolated. Former allies were distancing themselves, international support was evaporating, and even longtime friends were counseling him to reconsider his position. The man who had once been celebrated as a Democrat was now being viewed as an obstacle to democratic governance. Colonel Bakary Fofana sat in his office at the military barracks in Bouaké, staring at the reports streaming across his desk. For 23 years, he had served in the Ivorian armed forces, surviving coups, civil wars, and countless political upheavals. He had sworn an oath to protect the Constitution and the people of Ivory Coast, but never before had these two loyalties seemed so directly aligned against the sitting president. The colonel's phone rang constantly with calls from fellow officers stationed across the country. The message was consistent. Soldiers were growing restless about President Ouattara's constitutional violation, and more importantly, they were hearing from their families and communities who expected them to take action. Lieutenant Colonel Aminata Diabate arrived at Fofana's office carrying a folder thick with reports from field commanders. As one of the highest-ranking female officers in the military, she had always been careful to maintain political neutrality. But the current crisis was testing everyone's limits. "Colonel, the situation is becoming impossible to ignore," she said, settling into a chair across from his desk. "Our soldiers are asking questions we cannot answer. How do we enforce laws when the president himself breaks the highest law of the land?" Fofana nodded grimly. The military had traditionally stayed out of politics since the return to democratic governance, but this felt different. Soldiers were not just government employees. They were citizens first, with families affected by the same problems facing all Ivorians: corruption, unemployment, and now constitutional crisis. Reports from the ground painted a complex picture. In Korhogo, soldiers had been approached by local chiefs asking them to support peaceful protests. In Daloa, military families were participating in demonstrations. Some younger soldiers were openly expressing support for the citizen movements calling for Ouattara to respect constitutional term limits. Major Jean-Baptiste Kouame, stationed in Yamoussoukro, the political capital, called with disturbing news. "Colonel, intelligence suggests the president's inner circle is considering emergency powers to suppress the growing protests. They want to use us to crack down on peaceful demonstrations." This revelation sent chills through the military leadership. Many officers remembered the 2010-2011 crisis when soldiers were forced to choose sides, leading to splits that nearly destroyed the military as an institution. The thought of using force against peaceful protesters defending the Constitution troubled even the most disciplined officers. Fofana decided to convene a meeting of regional commanders. Under the cover of a routine security briefing, 12 senior officers gathered at the Bouaké barracks. The discussion was unprecedented. For the first time in years, military leaders were openly discussing their role in protecting democracy, rather than just following government orders. Commander Alassane Ouattara, no relation to the president, from the northern regions brought concerning intelligence. "The Presidential Guard is being reinforced with foreign mercenaries," he reported. "Our sources suggest they don't trust regular army units to suppress protests if ordered." This news crystallized the dilemma facing the military. They were being bypassed by their own commander-in-chief, who apparently doubted their loyalty to his unconstitutional actions. For career soldiers who had dedicated their lives to serving their country, this was deeply insulting. Captain Mariam Traoré, a young intelligence officer, presented analysis that surprised everyone. "According to our monitoring, support for the president's third term is virtually non-existent among active military personnel. Even officers who previously supported his policies are now questioning his constitutional violation." The meeting took an unexpected turn when Sergeant Major Sylvain Kone, a veteran with 30 years of service, stood to address the group. As the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer present, his words carried special weight among the enlisted ranks. "Colonels, with respect, this isn't about politics anymore," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "My son is unemployed despite his university degree. My daughter can't afford medical care for her children. We've watched this government make promises while the president's friends get richer. Now he wants to break the Constitution too? Our oath is to protect the people and the Constitution, not to enable a dictator." His words resonated deeply with the assembled officers. Many had joined the military believing they were serving a democratic nation that had overcome its authoritarian past. The idea of returning to an era where presidents served indefinitely was anathema to everything they had fought to build. Colonel Fofana realized they needed to establish contact with the civilian protest movement. Through careful intermediaries, a meeting was arranged with student leader Samuel Traoré and some civil society representatives. The location was secret, a small community center in a residential neighborhood of Bouaké. The meeting was historic. For the first time since independence, military leaders and civilian activists were cooperating to defend democratic principles against their own government. Samuel was initially skeptical. Previous military interventions had often made things worse. But Colonel Fofana's sincerity and his detailed knowledge of constitutional law impressed the young activist. "We're not talking about a coup," Fofana emphasized. "We're talking about refusing illegal orders and standing with the people to defend our constitution. There's a difference between overthrowing democracy and protecting it." The civilian leaders shared intelligence about growing support for their movement. Teachers' unions were planning strikes. Market associations were organizing boycotts of government-connected businesses. Even some traditional chiefs, normally aligned with whoever held power, were quietly expressing support for constitutional order. Lieutenant Colonel Diabaté proposed a coordinated strategy. The military's role should be protective, not offensive. "We ensure peaceful protesters can exercise their constitutional rights. We refuse orders to suppress legitimate demonstrations. We maintain order without enabling constitutional violations." News of military restiveness reached President Ouattara quickly through his intelligence networks. Emergency meetings were held at the presidential palace, with advisors split between those urging compromise and hardliners pushing for decisive action against both protesters and disloyal military officers. Defense Minister Tene Birahima Ouattara found himself in an impossible position. His own generals were questioning orders, while the president demanded absolute loyalty. Secret recordings leaked to Marie Kouassi's radio station revealed heated arguments within the government about how to handle military dissent. The president's response was to replace several regional military commanders with officers considered more loyal. However, this move backfired when the dismissed officers were welcomed as heroes by the protest movement. Colonel Fofana received word that he would soon be transferred to a desk job in the capital, a clear message that his independence was no longer tolerated. Instead of intimidating the military leadership, these actions only strengthened their resolve. Officers who had been uncertain about challenging the president now saw that their careers were already at risk, simply for maintaining constitutional principles. The government's heavy-handed response was creating exactly the kind of unified military opposition it had hoped to prevent. As the week progressed, reports emerged of military units across the country refusing orders to disperse peaceful protests. In some cases, soldiers actually provided security for demonstrators, ensuring that agent provocateurs couldn't incite violence that would justify a crackdown. The situation reached a tipping point when the Presidential Guard attempted to arrest Colonel Fofana for insubordination. However, his soldiers refused to allow the arrest, surrounding their commander and making it clear they would resist any attempt to remove him. Similar scenes played out at bases across the country, with enlisted personnel backing their officers against what they saw as illegal government actions. President Ouattara now faced a reality no African leader wants to confront. His own military, the ultimate guarantor of his power, was slipping away. The soldiers weren't rebelling for personal gain or ethnic advantage. They were standing up for principles that transcended traditional political divisions. The international community began taking notice as well. Reports of military units supporting constitutional protesters rather than the sitting president created confusion among foreign governments that had long supported Ouattara. Diplomatic cables suggested that even traditional allies were beginning to question their support for his third-term bid. The morning sun cast long shadows across Abidjan's bustling streets as Marie Kouassi hurried to her job at the local radio station. She had worked as a news reporter for 8 years, but today felt different. The air seemed thick with tension, and fewer people filled the usually crowded markets. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from sources across the country, all carrying the same disturbing news. President Alassane Ouattara had announced his intention to seek a controversial third term, despite constitutional limits that clearly stated a president could only serve 2 terms. The announcement had sent shockwaves through the West African nation, already fragile from years of political instability and civil conflict. At the radio station, Marie's editor, Thomas, paced nervously around the newsroom. His usual calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by the worried expression of a man who had covered too many political crises. The phones never stopped ringing, with citizens calling to express their outrage and confusion about the president's decision. "Marie, we need to get to the bottom of this," Thomas said, his voice strained. "People are already gathering in the streets. I'm hearing reports from Bouaké, Man, and even here in Abidjan. This isn't just political opposition anymore." Marie nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She had covered Ouattara's rise to power after the disputed 2010 election that had torn the country apart. Back then, Laurent Gbagbo had refused to step down after losing the election, leading to months of violence that killed over 3,000 people. Now the tables seemed to have turned, with Ouattara himself appearing to cling to power. As she prepared for her afternoon broadcast, Marie received a call from her cousin Adjoa, who worked at the university in Kakadi. "Marie, you need to see what's happening here," Adjoa whispered urgently. "The students are organizing. They're not just angry about the 3rd term. They're talking about years of broken promises, unemployment, and corruption." The university had become a hotbed of political activity. Young people who had supported Ouattara in previous elections now felt betrayed. They had believed his promises of democratic governance and economic prosperity, but many still struggled to find jobs. Despite their education, the cost of living had continued to rise while wages remained stagnant. Marie drove to the university campus, her journalist instincts telling her this was where the real story was unfolding. What she found surprised her. The protest wasn't chaotic or violent. It was organized and purposeful. Students had created committees to coordinate their activities, and they were reaching out to other groups across the country. Samuel Traoré, a 3rd-year political science student, had emerged as one of the leaders. His grandfather had fought for independence from France, and Samuel felt that same spirit of resistance flowing through his generation. "We cannot allow democracy to die while we watch," he told the gathered crowd. "Our constitution means nothing if leaders can simply ignore it when convenient." The students weren't alone. Marie noticed that some professors had joined them, along with market traders, taxi drivers, and even some government workers who had taken time off to participate. The movement was crossing traditional boundaries of class, ethnicity, and profession. Word spread quickly through social media and messaging apps. Videos of peaceful protests began circulating, showing citizens holding up copies of the Constitution and chanting for respect of democratic principles. The hashtag #Respect Our Constitution began trending across French-speaking West Africa. By evening, Marie's radio station was receiving calls from rural areas reporting similar gatherings. Farmers in the northern regions, who had long felt neglected by the government in Abidjan, saw an opportunity to voice their frustrations. Cocoa farmers complained about low prices while the president's allies profited from export deals. The religious communities also began to take notice. Imam Abdullah Kone from the Grand Mosque in Bouaké issued a statement calling for peaceful dialogue and respect for constitutional order. Christian leaders echoed similar sentiments, with Pastor Emmanuel Yao organizing prayer vigils for national unity. Marie realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. Previous political movements in Ivory Coast had often divided along ethnic or regional lines, with the North supporting one side and the South another. This time, the opposition to Ouattara's 3rd term was bringing together people from all backgrounds united by a single principle: respect for democratic institutions. As she filed her evening report, Marie couldn't help but think about her own children. Her daughter was studying law at university, while her son worked as a mechanic in the city. Both had grown up during Ouattara's presidency, believing that their country had finally achieved stability and democratic governance. Now they faced the possibility of returning to the dark days of political crisis and uncertainty. The government's response was swift but measured. Information Minister Amadou Coulibaly appeared on state television, urging calm and promising that all constitutional procedures would be followed. However, his words did little to calm the growing unrest. Legal scholars were already debating whether Ouattara's previous terms counted toward the constitutional limit, given changes to the Constitution in 2016. Opposition political parties, which had been fragmented and weak, suddenly found themselves with unexpected popular support. Leaders who had struggled to fill rally venues were now receiving calls from citizen groups offering to organize events. The political landscape was shifting rapidly, and traditional power structures were being challenged from below. As night fell across Ivory Coast, Marie reflected on the day's events. The country stood at a crossroads, much like it had in 2010. But this time, the challenge to presidential power was coming not just from political elites, but from ordinary citizens who had developed a taste for democratic governance and were unwilling to see it taken away. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Ouattara's grip on power, but the very foundations of Ivorian democracy. The people had spoken clearly. They wanted their constitution respected and their voices heard. The question now was whether their president would listen, or whether the country would once again slide into the kind of crisis that had defined its recent history. The port of Abidjan, usually bustling with cargo ships and commercial activity, had become eerily quiet as the constitutional crisis entered its third week. Dock workers, inspired by the growing movement against President Ouattara's third term, had organized work slowdowns that were beginning to strangle the country's economy. Kwadio Asamoah, who had worked at the port for 15 years, stood with his fellow longshoremen as they watched ships waiting offshore, unable to unload their cargo. "We handle the goods that make this country rich," he told his colleagues. "But our children still can't find jobs while the president's friends build mansions. If he won't respect our constitution, why should we keep making him rich?" The port slowdown was just one example of how the political crisis was rapidly becoming an economic catastrophe. Ivory Coast's economy, heavily dependent on cocoa exports and international trade, was particularly vulnerable to civil unrest and political instability. Market trader Fatou Diallo had seen her business in Abidjan's Adjamé market decline dramatically as customers worried about the country's future. People were hoarding money rather than spending it, and international buyers were becoming reluctant to make large purchases from suppliers in a politically unstable country. "Even my regular customers from Ghana are asking questions," Fatou explained to her sister. "They want to know if their shipments will arrive on time, if the borders will stay open, if the currency will remain stable. I can't answer these questions anymore." The Central Bank of West African States, which managed the regional CFA franc currency, issued warnings about capital flight from Ivory Coast as investors grew nervous about the political situation. Banking records showed wealthy Ivorians transferring money to accounts in Europe and neighboring countries as a hedge against potential instability. Jean-Baptiste Kouakou, an economics professor at the University of Cocody who had joined the student protests, analyzed the economic impact for international media. His research showed that political uncertainty was already costing the country millions of dollars daily in lost productivity, canceled investments, and reduced consumer confidence. What we're seeing is a classic example of how political crises become economic crises, Professor Kouakou explained. Investors hate uncertainty, and nothing creates uncertainty like a president refusing to respect constitutional term limits. The parallel with 2010-2011 is obvious, and everyone remembers how that economic collapse affected ordinary families. International companies with operations in Ivory Coast began implementing contingency plans. Tulip Cocoa Processing, a Dutch company with a major facility in San Pedro, quietly began reducing inventory and delaying planned expansions. Company executives held emergency meetings about potentially suspending operations if the political crisis escalated. The tourism industry, which had been slowly recovering from the previous civil war, suffered immediate impacts as international visitors canceled trips. Hotels in Grand Bassam and other coastal destinations reported occupancy rates dropping to less than 20%, as foreign tourists avoided what they perceived as an unstable destination. Marie Kouassi, in her role as a journalist, received economic data that painted an increasingly dire picture. Tax revenues were falling as businesses struggled, and informal economic activity increased. Government workers were beginning to worry about salary payments, especially as some regions controlled by opposition-sympathetic military units were no longer forwarding tax collections to the central government. The cocoa industry, which generated roughly 40% of the country's export revenue, began showing signs of strain. Farmers in regions supporting the constitutional movement started organizing to withhold their crops from government marketing boards, demanding that revenues not be used to fund Ouattara's unconstitutional third-term campaign. Kofi Mensah, a cocoa farmer from the western region near the Liberian border, had organized his cooperative to support the constitutional movement. "This cocoa money has been feeding the corruption in Abidjan for too long," he told a gathering of farmers. "If they want our crops, they need to respect our constitution." International commodities markets began reflecting concerns about Ivorian political stability. Cocoa futures prices increased as traders worried about supply disruptions, while investment firms downgraded their recommendations for companies with significant exposure to the Ivorian economy. The telecommunications sector experienced unique challenges as the government attempted to limit communication among protesters while maintaining essential services. Mobile phone companies found themselves caught between government demands for surveillance and customer demands for privacy and reliable service. Banking sector stress began appearing as customers withdrew savings to protect against potential currency devaluation or bank closures. ATMs in major cities frequently ran out of cash as people hoarded physical currency, remembering lessons from previous political crises when banking systems had collapsed. Small businesses suffered disproportionately from the economic uncertainty. Mama Aya, who ran a small restaurant in Bouaké near Colonel Fofana's military base, saw her daily customers dwindle as people tightened their spending. "Even the soldiers don't come as much anymore," she observed. "Everyone is saving money in case things get worse." The construction industry, which had been booming under Ouattara's infrastructure development programs, ground to a halt as contractors worried about payment guarantees from a government facing legitimacy questions. Chinese construction companies working on highway projects received instructions from Beijing to suspend major investments pending political clarification. Foreign direct investment, which had been flowing into Ivory Coast as investors viewed it as a stable democracy, dried up almost completely. The Investment Promotion Agency reported that scheduled meetings with potential investors were being canceled or postponed indefinitely. Energy sector problems compounded the economic crisis as protesters targeted government-connected companies while avoiding damage to essential services. Power plants continued operating, but fuel distribution networks faced disruptions as truck drivers joined solidarity strikes. Regional economic integration also suffered as neighboring countries began questioning trade relationships with a country in constitutional crisis. Ghana temporarily increased border inspections of goods from Ivory Coast, citing security concerns, but effectively slowing cross-border commerce. The informal economy, which employed the majority of Ivorians, proved both more resilient and more politically significant than formal businesses. Street vendors, taxi drivers, and small traders could adjust quickly to changing circumstances, but they also formed the backbone of the protest movement with their flexibility and numbers. Currency speculation became a growing problem as some wealthy individuals attempted to profit from the crisis by betting against the CFA france's stability. While the regional currencies pegged to the euro provided some protection, internal confidence was shaking as people remembered previous devaluations during political crises. International credit rating agencies began reviewing Ivory Coast's sovereign debt ratings, with warnings that continued political instability could lead to downgrades that would make future borrowing more expensive. Government bonds traded on international markets began showing stress as investors demanded higher premiums for political risk. The agricultural sector beyond cocoa also faced challenges as farmers worried about access to inputs and markets. Rice farmers in the northern regions, already struggling with irregular rainfall, found their situation complicated by political divisions that affected government agricultural support programs. Export-oriented industries began lobbying the government for resolution of the political crisis, warning that continued instability would damage the country's reputation as a reliable trade partner. The coffee sector, timber industry, and palm oil producers all reported similar concerns about maintaining international relationships. Economic analysts noted that the crisis was creating a dangerous feedback loop. Political instability was causing economic problems which were intensifying popular opposition to the government, which was deepening the political crisis. Breaking this cycle would require decisive action to restore constitutional order and investor confidence. Youth unemployment, already a major problem before the crisis, worsened as companies postponed hiring and reduced operations. This created additional support for the protest movement, as young people saw their economic prospects dimming under a government that seemed more concerned with maintaining power than addressing their needs. As the economic pressure mounted, even government supporters began questioning whether Ouattara's third term was worth the mounting costs. Business leaders who had previously stayed out of politics started private conversations about the need for political resolution to prevent complete economic collapse. Inside the presidential palace in Abidjan, the atmosphere had become suffocating with tension and paranoia. President Alassane Ouattara sat in his private office, surrounded by advisors whose conflicting counsel only deepened his isolation. The man who had once commanded respect as a democrat and economic reformer now found himself trapped by his own ambitions and the growing chorus demanding his departure. His wife, Dominique Ouattara, had become increasingly vocal in private meetings, urging him to reconsider his position. "Alassane, look at what this is doing to the country," she pleaded during a heated conversation that palace staff could hear through closed doors. "This isn't the legacy you wanted to leave. The people are united against us in a way I've never seen." Defense Minister Alassane Ouattara, the president's brother, brought increasingly disturbing reports from military commanders across the country. Traditional loyalists were questioning orders. Entire units were refusing to act against protesters, and some bases had effectively declared neutrality in the constitutional crisis. "Mr. President, we're losing control of the security apparatus," the defense minister reported during an emergency cabinet meeting. "Colonel Fofana in Bouaké has become a hero to his troops for defending the Constitution. Our own soldiers are asking why they should follow orders from a government that breaks the supreme law." Presidential advisor Patrick Achi, who had served Ouattara faithfully for years, found himself in the uncomfortable position of delivering unwelcome truths. Intelligence reports painted a picture of unprecedented unity among opposition forces, with even traditional allies beginning to distance themselves from the administration. "Sir, our polling shows support for your third term at less than 15%. And that's only in areas where people fear retaliation for honest answers," Achi reported. "The business community is panicking about economic instability. International partners are pressuring us to step down, and now our own military is questioning orders." The president's inner circle had shrunk dramatically as advisors found excuses to be elsewhere or quietly submitted resignations. Only the most loyal remained, and even they struggled to present realistic options for maintaining power without triggering a complete collapse of state institutions. Foreign Minister Candia Camara brought reports of diplomatic isolation that shocked even hardened political operatives. "Every embassy is asking about transition plans," she informed the cabinet. The French ambassador was quite direct. "Paris cannot support constitutional violations regardless of past relationships. Even China is hedging its bets." In the palace corridors, staff members whispered about the surreal atmosphere. Cooks prepared meals that went uneaten, drivers waited for trips that were canceled, and security guards wondered if they were protecting a legitimate government or a regime losing all credibility. Presidential Press Secretary Amadou Coulibaly faced the impossible task of defending the indefensible to increasingly skeptical media. His daily briefings had become exercises in creative interpretation of constitutional law that convinced no one and further damaged the administration's credibility. How do you explain to journalists that the Constitution doesn't mean what it clearly says? Coulibaly complained to colleagues. I've spent my career defending democratic principles, and now I'm being asked to argue against them. It's destroying my professional reputation. The president's daily routine had become a series of crisis meetings that produced no solutions. Morning security briefings revealed growing military defection, afternoon economic reports showed accelerating decline, and evening political assessments painted pictures of isolation and vulnerability. Chief of Staff Fidel Sarasoro, one of the few remaining confidants, attempted to present alternative strategies during private meetings with the president. Sir, we could announce a transition timeline, position it as magnanimous leadership, and preserve some dignity while we still can, he suggested. However, Ouattara's responses had become increasingly erratic and defensive. Years of wielding presidential power had made it difficult for him to imagine stepping down voluntarily, even as the costs of staying became overwhelming. Palace security arrangements reflected the growing paranoia within the administration. The Presidential Guard had been reinforced with foreign mercenaries, creating tension with regular military units that viewed these outsiders with suspicion and hostility. Intelligence Minister Vagondo Diomande reported that surveillance of opposition leaders was becoming counterproductive as it exposed government weakness rather than opposition vulnerabilities. Every action we take against protesters only demonstrates their popular support, he admitted. The president's adult children had become divided about their father's position. Some urged him to step down gracefully to preserve the family's reputation, while others encouraged him to fight to maintain their privileged positions. These family divisions added personal anguish to the political crisis. International phone